Welcome everybody to our final session of reading Dance to the Music of Time 2025. Here we are in 2026 already. And it's sort of sad to see that this is going to be our last session together. It's been great to have the participation that we've had in this group. It's absolutely made a wonderful experience for me, and I hope for everybody else. So we'll just start with just a little, as usual, a little presentation to remind us where we are. And I think we're all pretty aware of that. So this is the last volume and part of Powell's absolutely wonderful and elegant and complicated design. One thing about this is we take a significant leap forward in time. So this is now, if we go by Hilary Sperling's timing, we're talking about between 1968 and the winter of 1969, early 1970. And so this is a big jump time frame also. And I'd be interested to hear some thoughts about why Powell chose to kind of fast forward in that manner from the relatively tight timing that we had seen up into the big leap with Temporary Kings. The fact that these two last books come so far apart in time frame. And just as a reference of what was going on, I thought it would be worth to dig up some newspaper headlines to remind us. In fact, it was a pretty tumultuous time in the late 60s. So the same sort of student protests that we hear about with parents as chancellor were going on all over the place in multiple countries. So even there in generally peaceful Norwich, we saw a burning of Union Jacks when Princess Margaret came for a visit in 1968. And throwing paint was sort of de rigueur in those days as a protest. So I found numerous examples of people throwing students, in fact, throwing paint on distinguished persons. Of course, hippie cults were a big thing, so there were lots of fears, even in little towns like Wilmslow. You see that they were worried about their hippie cult, which seemed to center on a 15-year-old local boy who had long hair and a cowbell around his neck. It didn't take much to set off the trigger for hippie cultism in those days. This is never mentioned in Poland. It's certainly an extreme example, but let's remember that the big event of December '69 that staggered a lot of people in the world was, in fact, the Taint LaBianca murders with Charles Manson and his gang, which were certainly the most satanic of the hippie cults that arose at that time. And while there's no implication on my part to equate Charles Manson and Scorp Murtlock, the point was that there were a lot of people frightened by the implications of what was going on with the hippie movement of those days. And of course, the big event in this book is we finally say goodbye to...
I'm running! I'm running!
Are you hearing the audio by anybody? Okay, great. Because I can't hear it myself. So.
You can't stop me! I'm leading now. I'm leading. I'm leading.
So there are many things about the film adaptation that I think we might differ with, but that was a nice way of handling Widmerpool's end, I thought, letting him go off into the midst for his final steps. I also wanted to share, Nicholas Burns sent me a little video message that he wanted to share with everybody. He can't be here today because he's teaching, so hopefully everyone will be able to hear this one as well.
Recording in progress. Good afternoon, everybody. I am unable to be with you because I am shortly speaking to a group discussing George Eliot, coordinated by Cheryl Hurley. But I wanted to firstly thank Brad for all he did in coordinating this discussion so elegantly and in such a distinguished manner, not only in leading the actual discussion, but in sending around the reviews of the individual novels, which will be such a resource to future critics of Poe, and in general, putting in such hard work in doing this. And I've really also appreciated the insights of my fellow discussants. I have not been able to attend since the military philosophers because I had to teach on Mondays in the fall, but I really appreciated what I was able to hear. I wanted to speak today about Ackworth and Wimberpool at the wedding of Ackworth's granddaughter Claire at Stourwater. And the backstory is, of course, Wimberpool at school 50 years before had ratted out Ackworth for, quote, sending a note, close quote, to
Peter Templar.
Peter Templar, obviously a note expressing some erotic desire. And Ackworth had been expelled for that reason, and Wimberpool, now having experienced the sexual practices of Murtlock's cult, he understands the imbrication of homosexuality in human nature. And this is a point per se where the authorial viewpoint does agree with him. Anthony Powell made clear, both in his fiction and nonfiction, that he was for what would today be called gay rights, and that although he was not necessarily a cheerleader for any particular counter-Puritanism, that he was not a Puritan either. And Wimberpool clearly wants to make amends and to atone. So what goes wrong? Why is the incident so disastrous? The narrative points this out in using the phrase melodramatic self-condemnation, because it's all about Wimberpool. It's not actually a gesture meant to occasion forgiveness or reconciliation. If Wimberpool really wanted to reconcile with Ackworth, all he does, and we have to remember Ackworth has counterpunched. Wimberpool says that he and Fairbrother got Wimberpool off boards and so on. So Ackworth has, in his own way, retaliated. All Wimberpool has to do is go up to Bertram and say, Bertram, good to see you. Congratulations on your granddaughter's wedding. You did such a good job in reading the lesson. You're looking very well. And Ackworth would have responded with bemused affability, and that would have been reconciliation. It would have been better not to say it, not to atone, and just be civil in the present. But Wimberpool is too narcissistic to do that. And in general, people always ask about the 12th book, why aren't people kinder to Wimberpool, given that he's so humiliated, he clearly has had his comeuppance. I think his own narcissism prevents that kindness. In general, I know there are going to be people in this discussion who don't like the 12th book, particularly people older than me who don't feel that AP captured the tone of the 1960s. Insofar as I experienced the 1960s, I was 5 when the decade ended. I was 4 when the decade ended. I think he captured the tone pretty well. But I know there are going to be people who feel differently. I do admire, it's hard to end a series. Ending a series is an architectonic feat. And when the first book is difficult, the second to last book is difficult, which is why the staggering achievement of Temporary Kings is so extraordinary. And the last book is difficult. And nobody ever has done it perfectly. But I think AP did as good a job as anyone has done. So I am an enjoyer of the 12th book. And again, I want to thank Brad and all of you for sharing this book together. Have a good discussion.
Okay, so that was great, the contribution from Nick. The last thing I wanted to mention was in digging up the contemporary reviews, I was reminded of how I came across Anthony Powell's work on the dance for the first time, which was my parents were subscribers to Time magazine, and I can remember it wasn't a particularly noteworthy review. It was, in fact, a very brief one. But this photo and its caption, duodecologist Anthony Powell, caused me, of course, to look up in the dictionary what the heck a duodecologist was, which our dictionary wasn't big enough to find that. So, but that intrigued me and kind of brought him onto my radar screen. So it's nice to finally have come together and found what this thing was. And actually, 50 years ago, 1976 was when the book came out in the U.S. and became, part of our literary history. So with that, let's open it up for discussion. Just as a thought, why? Okay, Richard, you great. Let's hear what you got to say.
Okay, well, yeah. Well,
Whoops, I'm sorry, I've got to change my audio settings because I'm not getting, if you'll bear with me for a moment. I may have to. Yeah, go ahead. I've got to.
Okay.
My audio problems are here.
Well, it hit me as I was reading this that an alternate title to Dance to the Music of Time would be Parties Blown Up. It seems that a lot of the plots involve a party that's going on where something disastrous happens. Somebody has a stroke. Winterpool gets people get stuff dumped on them. It's just there just seems to be a great many parties in these 12 books, ending with this wedding reception where Winterpool does that. The other thing that struck me was Winterpool goes out about the same way that he comes into the books, which is that kind of like not particularly athletic running. That's kind of how Nick kind of remembers him coming into focus in the first book, and this, of course, he goes out running as we just saw in the last book. So I guess that's and then there's a brief reference at the very end of the book to the scene in the first book with looking at the guys standing around the flaming canister, reminding him of the painting. So yeah, it kind of ties a ribbon on Winterpool.
I apologize, folks. I still can't hear anything for some reason. Having played the video, it seems to have cut off my own ability to hear myself or hear the discussion. So please continue your discussion while I try to decipher what's going on here.
I'm done.
Okay, if nobody else is going to jump in, I'll just make one observation. My feeling has always been that hearing Secret Harmonies and books are the two weakest volumes of the series. And I never felt that AP, I'm one of those people who never felt that AP really captured the time. Remembering that I was 18 in 1969 and just going to university. So, I mean, one knew about what was going on in the background. Not so much about the deep cults, but I never felt I got it quite right. And I remember making this point to Lord Grey Gary, who was our president for some years. Those in the UK will remember Grey as Minister for the Arts in one of Margaret Thatcher's administrations. I made this comment to Grey in public after a AP lecture, annual lecture, and he said, "Yes, but you must remember that he and you and I would have had very different experiences of the 60s. He said, I was half a handful of years too old to really appreciate, the swinging 60s and 70s. And I guess in a way I was 2 or 3 years possibly too young. But he said, AP was 65. And yeah, of course it's going to be a different perspective. I mean, it's like me now saying I'm going to write a book centered around, modern student culture or, that era. I haven't got a clue. I mean, AP probably had more of a clue from his extended family, but, is it surprising? No, not really. And looking back and reading the book again, I can see that, and I can see where he's sort of not fully grasping, everything that was going on at the time.
So, Keith, do you feel like it's that what he portrays is portrayed incorrectly, or that he's not showing us the right part of what's going on in culture and life?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure. He effectively admits, that he doesn't understand what's going on. I mean, see all the comments about, Murdoch's cult and so on, and not understanding what they're doing, and he more or less says that in the book. I think he's I don't think he's getting a full picture. He's portraying, not unreasonably, what he is seeing of the picture, which is going to be incomplete.
Cheryl, have you got your hand up? Are you wanting to jump in? You're on mute there for a second.
You're on mute, Cheryl.
Okay, I think I got it now. I was wondering, I appreciate what you've said, Keith. I think a lot of us feel that way to some extent. What it came down to for me is that it is more the register, the way that Poe writes. It's the writing that feels not 60s. It feels right for the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, but somehow the language was a little flabbier, maybe less precise. So it's not the incidents, it's the way, it's the language that gives him away a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I was, mentally searching after that. John Blackster?
Make sure I'm unmuted first of all. I've actually come to rather like hearing Secret Harmonies, more so than when it first came out, when I did have my doubts about what we've been calling authenticity. I think particularly about the about Murtlock and so on, because as years went by, a lot of these characters changed so that you could see that, you know, the beginnings were there. And for instance, when you think of so many of the people, I mean, I was in 1968, I was 20, so I was into my sort of second year at art college, you know, and the whole of Hornsey was on strike, and we had visits to my college by people inciting us to drop our paintbrushes and go on strike. And then later on, you saw these people gradually being assimilated into mainstream politics, and then, of course, ending up in the loathed House of Lords and so on. You know, the hypocrisy of all that was quite extraordinary, or not hypocrisy, perhaps a sort of, you know, changing ideals as you go on. I would like to just mention the caravan, because I always find it quite. I did read an article just recently. It was talking about the 1968, 1967, those sort of fairly crucial years, which were triggered a little bit by the Duke of Bedford opening up Woburn Abbey for a pop festival in 1967, which at the age of 18, I was delighted to be able to attend. And that was very much the sudden collision of aristocracy and hippies. And the article was talking about Matt, saying that exactly, rather like Brad's introduction, there was hippiedom in this country, as experienced, you know, by myself at that age, was much less about, was much less sinister and much less violent. You know, you didn't have the same, well, you know, sort of Black Panthers and all that sort of, you know, that end of politics. And there was, of course, the famous Sir Mark Palmer, who was a godchild of the Queen, who he had his hippie caravan, and he was indeed married to the daughter of Lord Glenconner, who was Princess Margaret's great friend on Mustique, and she was an astrologer. In fact, she you know, wrote books about astrology and so on and so forth. And I did wonder if at some time AP's and Lady Violet's world had sort of taken that on board, that people in gypsy caravans were probably most unlikely to be Irish travellers at that time, but were much more likely to be somebody whose, I said, godmother was the Queen. You know, he himself was in between being in the gypsy caravan. He was something like a sort of a page boy, I think that's right. He had to carry the Queen's train, you know, the train of her dresses at court occasions. So I found that much more authentic when you don't try and think this is like the hard line and the scruffy and the more sort of art school end of hippiedom was probably much more dilettante and so on. Probably Rusty was the only sort of authentic character in that little quartet. Also, I would like to mention one of my favorite characters, and that's Canon Furno, who comes in, but I'm just saying that now. There may be room for me to say something later about him.
Richard?
Yeah, I think part of this, part of a good way to look at Pohl's perspective on the 60s is toward the end, where he goes back and sees the art of his old family friend, which was pretty much dismissed by everybody in the 30s, is now suddenly hot again. And you get this sense of this too shall pass. So doesn't necessarily take all this stuff seriously. Like, he's reminded of Trelawney running around in his robes when the cult shows up at his backyard, and all these things that keep bringing back things he remembers from the past, to the point where he gets kind of frustrated because there are people he's talking to who do not have as good a memory as he does, something that I run into like weekly. because I have a really good memory for really bad things that happen, which I think is something akin to what Cole may have experienced. But yeah, so the perspective is on the 60s is, yeah, been there, done that. It's the generation that went through the war, World War II. So yeah, it's not going to be like, oh wow, we're experiencing things for the first time because we're 18, kind of experience of the 60s that perhaps we're used to. And also, I think he's looking at Widmerpool as kind of the fool. He's chasing this. He's trying to experience the 60s, and he just, because he's like, well, don't call me Lord anymore, blah blah. And it's like he goes native, and I think that's the perspective, and that's why it doesn't look like it's a authentic version of the 60s, because it's the advantage, as we mentioned before, it's the advantage of a 60s of a guy who's uh, experienced all this other stuff that we have experienced with him.
Yeah. Can you all hear me? I think I figured out my audio problems.
Yes,
Anyway.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Raymond?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think I liked the book, but I think it is definitely one of the weaker books, if not the weakest, and it's very much overshadowed by the previous book. And I didn't really find Murtlock particularly believable as a character. The other thing I have a problem is that I find the decline and fall of Widmerpool I don't really believe it either. The way his character develops in this particular book. But I wanted to come back. I think you asked the question, Brad. Why does he have these big time gaps? And I have no idea. But I remember thinking that the third book in the War trilogy, there was too much. There was too much of it, and then we miss out on all the good stuff in the 50s. Right. I don't really. I mean, I've never looked into this, but I would like to know why he did it the way he did, and why he didn't just carry on writing about these characters and what happened to them in the 50s, which would seem to me a much more ultimately satisfactory way to round out the sequence.
Well, one could suggest, I think, that leaping forward put him in a time frame where many of the characters would die. Whereas, not, the ones who were dying in the 50s were more of his parents' generation, whereas his counterparts are still too young to be picked off. I mean, when I was thinking to myself about why did he take this leap forward, particularly because it did sort of take the Nicholas Jenkins character and Nicholas Jenkins world into this uncomfortable period where youth is running off in a different direction and they really don't understand much of that. It was a neat way in which he could bump off a bunch of people logically. I think if he'd done more in the 50s, he would have been in a trap of, well, okay, it's not going to work into a neat 12 volume, framework. But there may be other reasons. I mean, sure, there are people who've studied this much more closely. Sally, and then John.
Okay. I want to take you on a journey here. I've gone through a treasure hunt through this novel of zodiac signs.
Wow.
And it's a recurring motif, and it really emphasizes the whole idea of alchemy and wizardry. But it actually goes back as far as Temporary Kings, where Mrs. Erdley reveals that Pamela is a Scorpio. It's very subtle. She doesn't really mention her by name, but she says the woman at the palazzo is a Scorpio. And we know that Nicholas says that his wife Isabel, in that same conversation, is a Pisces. And the next page, she talks about hearing secret harmonies. So this is way before the book, the actual book.
Mm-hmm.
Then, got my little notes here. There's Cancer, and that's the crustaceans, the crayfish. They're summoning the crayfish. So that's Cancer. Virgo is, well, first of all, Gemini is the twins, the quick and
Right,
Gemini.
absolutely.
Virgo is Fiona.
I think you're cracking a code here.
You know, it goes all the way through, and it really does emphasize the whole idea of, sometimes it's very overt, like Scorpio is
Right.
Scorp, Murloc. And then at the very end, almost the very last sentence, let me get my glasses here. The end of the book. The very last paragraph, the distant pounding of centaurs' hooves are dying away. And that is Sagittarius, and that's Nicholas. Because Nicholas says, I am the archer, I am the centaur. He says it in the very first book. So it goes from the beginning to the end and just wraps it up. I just had a lot of fun with that. Can I write an essay on that?
My eyes are open in a big way. I and because we know that Powell was sort of interested in that. I mean, from a hobby standpoint, perhaps, but.
And his mother.
Wow. I think Richard's got it right. Somebody's got a PhD dissertation.
Yes.
Working in this.
I hate to say it, but I have a feeling it's already been done.
Okay. But it was fun for me.
And I think that the theme runs all the way through the 12 books, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, but the references are so sort of incidental that I have to say, I'm not into astrology at all. And so I just like, oh, okay, move on. And no, absolutely. I hadn't even clued to Scorp Murloc. Duh.
Well, Nicholas says, why was he named Scorp? And he says, because he's a scorpion. So,
right.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
John? Thank you.
Hi there. And thank you, Brad, for running this whole series so well. I think it's been great fun, and I'd like to endorse what Nicholas said. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book the third time. I think on my first run round the 12, I felt a little let down by hearing Secret Harmonies, whereas this time I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I felt I was seeing it in a slightly different light as well, partly through this routine of reading a novel every month. And I think the spread of the last three books is actually what I think it works really well, and wouldn't have worked because you've got this books deals with this post-war period. Temporary Kings deals with the sort of the death of the 50s, in just about on the cusp of the 60s, and then Hearing Secret Harmonies is really a 70s book. I think I think all the last three books were written and published in the 70s. So to me, it feels very much Powell dealing with the 70s rather than the 60s. Because everything, the sort of hope of the 60s had all sort of, I mean, I've an age that I can remember thinking I've just missed out on the 60s, and here's the 70s, and it's all falling apart. And, we now think of, postmodernism beginning in the early 70s, which is where you could make books and art and songs in a very fragmented, fractured way. And I feel this is quite a postmodernist book, and Powell throws lots of things in. Although through his reminiscences, we hear quite a lot about the earlier characters, many of whom have died. We hear a lot more about them in hearing Secret Harmonies. And there's a comment someone made about the way characters change. Blanche, for example, the Dottie sister, is now the person who can actually communicate with young people. And that seems entirely convincing. Fiona Cutts is, appears to be a kind of archetypical hippie, but she's actually the daughter of a Tory MP, and she's obviously going to sort of, come end up as a Daily Mail columnist or something like that. And
Right.
you've got other great characters. Gilbert is the poet who's also a PR man. Feels like a very 70s character to me. I'm sure I met people like that. So I think Pohl knows that he at 65 odd he can't really be a protagonist in this, but he's just as good a listener as he was when he was a teenager. And I also think that Pohl, as very involved in the literature of that time, as a reviewer himself, and also commissioning others to write all the new books, I think he was acutely aware of what was coming out, even if he didn't attempt to be down with the kids. He was just observing everyone else's observations of that time. He was reading, as we know from the murals, he was reading the Sunday Times color supplement assiduously, and I'm sure we could find a few features about hippie caravans run by people who were actually, godsons of the of the Queen, and Mark Boxer, who illustrated all the books, who's the editor of the Sunday Times color supplement, and was drawing these very witty observations of the people of that time. I think Powell was able to filter that stuff in a way that made sense to him, and it doesn't matter that he never went to a pop music festival and wouldn't have known, what to do or how to interpret it. I now think that doesn't matter at all, and this makes a very fine ending to the sequence. Sorry, one last observation is that I believe he was originally thinking it as a 10 novel sequence, and the decision to make it 12 came fairly late on. I'm sure Nicholas Burns knows this, so maybe other people there wouldn't know this. So I think there was a kind of change of gear to I can do these last three books across a much wider time span and make a different kind of 12 novel sequence out of it. And I think he did it magnificently. So, and thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for the wonderful series of.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that. And I think we mentioned this a little bit in talking about Temporary Kings, but let's just keep in mind the fiction landscape of the early 70s, which was really, I mean, most extreme, let's say Portnoy's Complaint, but Myra Breckenridge. I mean, there was a lot more open discussion of sexuality and different approaches to sexuality. And it's hard to believe that hearing Secret Harmonies isn't in part a response and embrace of that, much more the literature of its time. But Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and thank you again for your hosting of these talks. I agree with John. I didn't particularly enjoy the book when I first read it, but I reread it over the last couple of days and enjoyed it more and found it more satisfying as a completion of the 12 novel sequence. Just a couple of things. One of my favorite characters appears in the last novel as he does in the first one. That's Bob Duport, and I think it's a measure of Pohl's generosity to people through Nick Jenkins, where Duport, who on the surface is a very unattractive character as he's portrayed through the novels, as Nick Jenkins says at the end, I liked him more than I had at the beginning.
Yeah.
And the other point I think is one notices, I mean, the Nick Jenkins style is very sort of hesitant, talks in parenthesis and all the rest of it. The Duport style, pungent, critical, no nonsense, is a very useful counterbalance whenever Duport appears in the 12 novel sequence. And it's the same in the last book, the famous Chateau Bottle shit reference to Widmerpool. And he gives Duport an artistic bent as well, even though characteristically Dupont's more interested in the prices of the pictures he's getting that he owns rather than the value of them. But I mean, I think that's the sort of the generosity to characters. And But the one question I have really, and I'm interested in other people's views on this, Russell Gwinnett as an American academic. I was never quite sure of Russell Gwinnett's believability, to be honest. He's a water skiing instructor at one point, I remember. It didn't bother me so much when I reread it again, but I still have this nagging doubt at the back of my mind. I mean, AP had lots of contact with Americans. And by the way, there's a nice little witty reference to Evangeline mentioned somewhere, which is no doubt Evangeline Bruce. We picked that up from Evangeline Bruce. He knew a lot of Americans, so I'm just wondering how true people who, those of you in the US, feel that Russell is as a portrait of a type of US academic. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, Paul. John?
Well, it's a very brief thing, and also Paul's really covered it. But when I did reread it, I suddenly thought how ironic it was that of the characters that are in the first novel, that Bob Duport of all people should be in the last pages of the last novel, when various times he's either been a rival or displayed as being not really AP's type of person at all. But of course, I mean, you want unsympathetic characters. Although personally, I always rather like Bob Duport, but then I quite like people like that, that are going to say, as you say, sort of terse, not quite obscene, not quite obscenities, but certainly, he's a bit uncouth, as they might say. And I thought he's an excellent character, and I was delighted, when I had remembered that he was there in the last few pages, but it was interesting. And of course, that he should be there with Jean as well. Because I can't think of any other characters from the first novel who made it through, apart from Jenkins.
Well, I mean, and to Paul's point, I mean, in the first book, Bob Duport is a real jerk. I mean, he's just like the classic jerk of that time frame, that class, male. And by the end, I think Nicholas and I mean, I agree with you. He's one of the few characters who, as the book develops, is honest. He's frank. He doesn't try to put a mask on in the way that Widmerpool is, sort of always presenting the person that he thinks he's supposed to be, rather than any sort of honesty and certainly not admission of vulnerabilities. So yeah, I agree with that. I like Paul. I mean, he does allow him, to get Jean and Polly Templar and all in one fell swoop in this final moment. So there's a certain amount of choreography, I think, intentionally involved with that. Keith?
Just a little quick perspective for Paul, who probably knows this as well as I do, but when Paul would have embarked on writing this novel, or the beginning of the time frame of this novel, his younger son John would not long have finished a year at Cornell. I think he was only there for a year, but and AP certainly went to America a number of times, while John was at Cornell, and I think from vague memory of probably the journal somewhere, had a couple of speaking engagements there. So he would have met, a number of American academics on their home ground.
Any thoughts on the question about Russell Gwinnett as a believable character? I have to say that, to some extent, he comes off more as a fictional tool than a character, in the sense that many of Pohl's characters are believable as sort of well-rounded. You could see them in different situations. Russell Gwinnett seems to be more a sort of a plot device, in my opinion. But any other views? I don't think it was typical American academic at that time, though certainly not the water skiing part. John?
in the book, I didn't really quite know whether, as you said, as from my point of view, whether he was a believer or not. I found in the television series, which is not really what we're talking about. We're talking about the books. But I found him, quite frankly, weird. I mean, I know he is weird, but I found, the actual acting was weird, and it made me aware of perhaps his lack of credibility in the book. I found it
I think I would agree with you in terms of the casting and, like the hairstyle. The actor they chose to play Russell Gwinnett was not believable as a character in that time, particularly in Temporary Kings portion of the show. That's just not how American academic, a tenured American academic would be much more buttoned up in those days, I would think.
One, if I'm allowed to come back to another favorite character, that's Canon Furno. I do remember, I think actually I think maybe in Nick Burns's book, but he talks there that Canon Furno himself is a little bit of a narrator, only very briefly, but he's sort of stands back. He's not phased, as I say, but by having to deal with Murtlock. He's very, in a way, distant, but also involved and sort of confident. I suppose almost sort of calm, really, in a way that he views things. I think he's certainly a character that could have been developed further, and I would like to have heard his views on other matters apart from just Scorpio.
Well, Powell does a lot of use throughout this series. There is a lot of use of other narrators. There's a lot of the book which is being told, Nick hearing stories of other people from other people at secondhand, particularly. I mean, Widmerpool's End is, I felt like that was like the only way for Widmerpool to end would have been through a third person separate. Nick should not have seen the end of Widmerpool. It would not have been credible because it would have been so much more dramatic, so much more overt than hearing of Widmerpool's demise. Keith?
Yeah, it on that point you're making about using other narrators, something that struck me is there's particularly a lot of it in the last three books.
Yeah.
Powell relies much more heavily on third person narrators, all sorts of them, and more than in the earlier books.
Yeah, I mean that's a great observation, which is, is it a change in Powell's style? Is it moving? I mean, anytime you rely on telling the story through another person, you have the sort of the stagecraft of you have to bring that other narrator into the scene with Nick, and then sort of take them out and work in this, other person's story into the narrative. Is that because he became more comfortable with more complex works of fiction? Is it more sort of reflection of age? I'd be interested to see somebody actually do some study of that, just like fleshing out the astrological connections of that, because we might have a better insight into why that happens. Raymond?
Is it not just that Nick really isn't involved in what's going on so much in the latter part of the sequence? His life he's gone off stage really, and the only way he gets in touch with all these stories about what's happening to people is by meeting people who've been involved. But he's he's sort of departed as a player, really, I think.
Well, it makes it much more credible. I mean, back to the discussion about the time gap. With that sort of a time gap, he has to have a lot of the, the backstories filled in by other people because he's not engaged in the incidents. Otherwise, volume 12 would be 450 pages long, which is completely out of Pohl's approach. I mean, did he ever exceed 300 pages in a book? Any of them? No. So, and I have to say, kudos to him because I've been in kind of delving a lot into fiction of the 20s, American fiction mostly of the 20s. And it seemed like every publisher said, look, if it's not at least 350 pages long, we're not publishing it. And my God, these are just such bloated books. Oh, so okay. Yes, Keith.
I think the only books that might get anywhere near 350 pages of the 2 volumes of collected
Right.
journalism, which is,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you see the end of Miscellaneous Verdicts, 498. And I think they're the only 2 that are going to are anywhere near.
We won't hold
over
that
300.
No, I have to say this is these one of the real things that I didn't really appreciate the first couple of times I read the series is they are a nice length. I don't know about you, but there are some times when you're about page 150 and you go, oh, okay, only 70 more to go versus, oh my God, I'm only a third of the way through this thing. I mean, there are times when big fiction works really well, but I, I think that's a classic example of anybody who's made it through a Thomas Wolfe novel knows that whatever kudos go to Max Perkins, scissors were not part of his forte and should have been. So. Okay, well, we're coming up towards the end of the hour. Are any other comments folks want to offer on the series? It's sort of overwhelming to reach the end and look back and realize there's so much terrain that covers. John Gould, could you unmute?
This is something that should have come up maybe a little bit earlier in this. I believe the second book, when Mrs. Erdley reads Nick's fortune and talks about one thing and another, she also goes into the zodiac a lot.
Yes.
And a student of mine is the young woman who noticed that Nick and Anthony Powell both have the same birthday, and she worked it out from the zodiac references of that talk. So, in considering the zodiac, it would be worth looking back much earlier in the sequence to see that Powell is well aware of it. That's all.
Maybe we'll have to put that as a marker for the next time if we do this again, we'll have to have the monthly focus on astrology. I'm convinced it's probably all over the place, and I personally would have just completely tuned that out, unfortunately. Okay, well, thank everybody for joining us. We will put this post this video up on YouTube as usual, and for those who are not moving over to the pilgrimage discussion, which I completely understand, it is a radically different series. Not only the fact that it has an odd number and not an elegant design, but it's a much different subject and much different much harder climbing at certain points in the sequence. Although to Dorothy Richards's credit, she like Powell generally confined herself to a reasonably length book for each individual volume. But we will have this up, and I regret that we have to bring this to an end. It's been a wonderful experience, and all of you have your participation has just been phenomenal. It's been such a treat to benefit from the expertise of folks who know much more about pole and the dance than I do. So thank you all, and happy reading.
Brad, thank you very much from, I think from, all of us, and particularly for, involving the society, which has been absolutely great. And yeah, I mean, I'm putting links to all the videos on our website as well. So the links are all there. Thank you.
I will say that reading or musicotime.com will stay online. It doesn't cost too much to leave it there, but certainly the society's got a much richer set of resources on your site. And so thank you for that, Keith.
I mean, if you do ever need to take them off YouTube, then
not unless they start charging money for these things, which they haven't yet.
But if it happens, then let us know, and we may well, certainly, I'm sure whoever's in the hot seat at the time will think about taking them over, as we have other things.
Okay.
Thanks,
thank
Brad.
you, everybody.
Thank you,
and
Brad.
take care.
Thank you.